He thought denying her a room would be a small decision, but he had no idea it would cost him everything he had worked for. The glass doors of the Grand Regent Hotel slid open with a quiet whisper as Emily Carter stepped inside, her worn sneakers barely making a sound against the polished marble floors that reflected golden chandeliers above. The lobby stretched wide and luminous, filled with the low hum of wealth, soft piano music drifting through the air, the faint scent of imported lilies, the muted conversations of guests dressed in tailored suits and evening dresses. Emily paused for just a second, taking it in, her simple denim jacket and modest handbag standing in quiet contrast to the elegance surrounding her, but her posture remained steady, her expression calm, as if she belonged anywhere she chose to stand. Behind the front desk, two receptionists exchanged a glance the moment they noticed her, subtle but unmistakable, their eyes flicking from her shoes to her jacket, then back to each other with the faintest hint of a smirk. It wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious, but it was there, the quiet judgment that filled the spaces between words. Emily approached the counter with an unhurried step, resting her hand lightly on the cool marble surface. "Good evening," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I'd like to book a room for tonight." The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a polished smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, tapped a few keys on the computer, though her attention seemed divided. "Do you have a reservation with us, ma'am?" she asked, her tone polite, but edged with something colder beneath. Emily shook her head gently. "No, I just arrived. I was hoping you might have availability." The receptionist hesitated, her fingers pausing mid-motion before she leaned slightly toward her colleague, whispering something too low to hear, though the faint curve of amusement on her lips said enough. Emily stood there, waiting, her hands loosely folded, her gaze steady, as if she had seen this moment play out before. A man in a dark suit standing nearby glanced over, his eyes lingering just a second longer than necessary, curiosity mixed with quiet dismissal. The seconds stretched, the air growing just a little heavier, until finally the receptionist straightened and looked back at Emily with a rehearsed expression. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice smooth, practiced. "We're fully booked tonight." For a brief moment, nothing moved. The piano continued playing somewhere in the background. A glass clinked softly at the bar, but right there at the desk, time seemed to slow. Emily tilted her head slightly, her eyes calm, almost thoughtful, as if weighing the words she had just heard. Then she glanced past the receptionist, noticing a couple being warmly greeted just a few feet away, their luggage already being taken, keys handed over with welcoming smiles. Her gaze returned, steady and quiet. "Fully booked?" she repeated, not challenging, just confirming. The receptionist gave a small nod, her smile tightening just enough to reveal the decision had already been made long before Emily stepped through those doors. And in that moment, as the soft glow of the chandeliers reflected in Emily's eyes, there was something else beneath her silence. Not embarrassment, not frustration, but a quiet patience, as if she knew that this story wasn't going to end the way they expected. And for the first time, though no one could quite explain why, the space around her began to feel different, like the calm before something no one in that room was prepared for. Emily held his gaze for a quiet moment longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if confirming something only she understood. "Thank you for your time," she said softly, her voice even, carrying neither resentment nor defeat. She turned slightly, her movements unhurried, and stepped away from the counter, the faint sound of her sneakers brushing against the marble floor echoing just enough to be noticed in the stillness that followed. A few guests nearby pretended to return to their conversations, but their attention lingered, drawn by something they could not quite name. Emily walked toward the seating area near the tall glass windows that overlooked the city, where the evening lights had begun to flicker on, casting reflections that shimmered across the polished surfaces inside. She set her small bag down on a chair and sat, folding her hands neatly in her lap, her posture relaxed, her expression calm, as though she had simply chosen to wait rather than been turned away. At the front desk, the receptionist exhaled quietly, her shoulders relaxing as she glanced at Richard Hayes. "That was awkward," she murmured under her breath. Richard gave a faint shrug, straightening his jacket with a practiced motion. "It happens," he replied, his tone dismissive, though there was a trace of impatience still lingering beneath it. "We have standards to maintain." He glanced across the lobby, his eyes briefly landing on Emily seated by the window, then looked away just as quickly, as if the situation had already been resolved in his mind. But something about the way she sat there, unbothered, composed, seemed to linger longer than he expected. The seconds passed, and the rhythm of the hotel resumed. The soft music, the quiet conversations, the steady flow of guests moving through the space. And yet, beneath it all, there was a subtle tension, like a thread that had been pulled but not yet released. Emily reached into her bag and took out her phone, her movements precise and unhurried. She looked at the screen for a brief moment, then tapped once, bringing it to her ear. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she listened, her eyes drifting toward the front desk, not with confrontation, but with quiet certainty. "Hi," she said finally, her voice low, gentle. "I just arrived." There was a pause, her expression unchanged as she listened again. "Yes," she continued softly, "I am in the lobby." Another pause, slightly longer this time, and then a faint smile touched the corners of her lips, subtle enough that it could easily be missed by anyone not paying close attention. "No, it is all right," she said. "Take your time." She lowered the phone and placed it back into her bag, her hands returning to rest lightly in her lap. From where he stood, Richard Hayes noticed the call, his eyes narrowing just slightly, curiosity flickering across his face before he masked it with indifference. "Probably calling for a ride," the receptionist whispered, her tone edged with quiet amusement. Richard did not respond right away. Instead, he adjusted his cuff again, his gaze drifting once more toward the woman by the window. There was something about her composure that did not quite fit the situation, something that resisted the conclusion he had already made. The revolving doors at the entrance continued their slow, steady movement, letting in the cool evening air each time they turned. Outside, the distant glow of headlights lined the street, cars passing by in a constant stream. And then, without warning, the rhythm shifted. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a change in the atmosphere rather than a sound, like the moment before a storm when the air grows still. A black car pulled up to the curb, its engine quiet, its presence deliberate. The valet straightened instinctively, his posture sharpening as he stepped forward. Inside the lobby, one of the bellmen glanced toward the entrance, his expression changing just enough to draw a second look from those nearby. Emily did not move. She simply sat there, calm, composed, as if she had been expecting this exact moment all along. And somewhere across the marble floor, Richard Hayes felt something shift deep in his chest, a faint, uninvited sense that the decision he had just made was about to become something far more significant than he had ever intended. The valet moved quickly, almost instinctively, as the black car came to a smooth and silent stop at the entrance, its polished surface reflecting the city lights like a mirror. He reached for the door handle with a level of attentiveness that was reserved only for the most important guests, his posture straightening, his expression sharpening into something more focused, more careful. The revolving doors turned slowly as the outside air slipped into the lobby, carrying with it a subtle shift that rippled through the space. Conversations softened, footsteps slowed, and a quiet awareness began to spread, as though something significant had just entered the building before anyone had even seen it. The car door opened, and a man stepped out with measured precision, his presence calm, but commanding, his tailored navy suit fitting perfectly, his movements deliberate without ever appearing rushed. Daniel Carter did not need to raise his voice or draw attention to himself. It followed him naturally, like gravity. The valet greeted him with a nod that carried more respect than words, and Daniel acknowledged it with a brief glance before stepping toward the entrance. Inside, one of the bellmen straightened instantly, recognizing him, while another quickly adjusted his tie, their reaction subtle but unmistakable. The receptionist noticed the shift first, her smile faltering for just a fraction of a second as she followed the direction of the staff's attention. "Is that?" she began quietly, her voice trailing off as realization started to form. Richard Hayes turned as well, his eyes landing on the man approaching through the glass doors, and in that moment, something inside him tightened. It was not fear, not yet, but recognition mixed with a sudden, unwelcome awareness that something was not aligning the way it should. Daniel stepped into the lobby, the soft echo of his shoes against the marble floor carrying further than expected, each step steady, controlled, unhurried. He did not look around at first. He did not need to. The space adjusted around him, the staff subtly repositioning, the atmosphere shifting into something more attentive, more alert. And then his gaze moved, scanning once, calm and precise, until it landed on Emily. She was still seated by the window, exactly where he expected her to be, her posture unchanged, her expression composed. For a brief moment, nothing else in the room seemed to exist. He walked toward her, each step deliberate, the distance between them closing in a quiet, inevitable line. Emily stood as he approached, her movements just as calm, just as controlled, and when their eyes met, there was no surprise, no urgency, only a quiet understanding that needed no explanation. "You took your time," she said softly, a faint smile touching her lips. Daniel's expression softened just slightly, the edge of authority giving way to something more personal. "I wanted to see how they would handle it," he replied, his voice low, steady. The words were not loud, but they carried, just enough for those closest to hear, just enough for the meaning to settle into the room. Behind the front desk, the receptionist felt her breath catch, her hands suddenly unsure of where to rest, while Richard Hayes stood frozen for a brief second too long, the pieces beginning to fall into place in a way he could no longer ignore. Daniel turned then, slowly, his gaze shifting toward the front desk, his expression returning to that calm, controlled authority that did not need to announce itself. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice. He simply began to walk forward, and with each step, the weight of what was about to happen grew heavier, settling into the marble, into the air, into the silence that had now taken over the entire lobby. And in that silence, one truth became impossible to escape. This was no longer a simple misunderstanding. This was the moment everything changed. Daniel Carter stopped just a few feet from the front desk, his presence alone enough to still every movement in the immediate space around him, the faint sound of the piano fading into something distant and almost irrelevant as the weight of the moment settled in. He did not speak right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch, his gaze moving calmly from the receptionist to Richard Hayes, taking in their expressions, their posture, the subtle tension in their shoulders that had not been there just minutes before. The receptionist lowered her eyes first, her confident demeanor from earlier dissolving into uncertainty, her hands hovering awkwardly above the keyboard, as if unsure whether to continue typing or simply remain still. Richard, however, held his ground for a fraction longer, his jaw tightening slightly as he attempted to regain control of the situation that was now slipping beyond his grasp. "Good evening, sir," he began, his voice carefully measured, though the edge of confidence was no longer as sharp as before. "Welcome to the Grand Regent. How may we assist you tonight?" Daniel's eyes rested on him, steady and unreadable, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the entire lobby leaned in, waiting for what would come next. "I believe," Daniel said slowly, his voice calm but carrying with effortless authority, "my wife was already assisted." The words landed quietly, but their meaning echoed far louder than any raised voice could have. The receptionist's breath caught, her eyes widening as the realization fully settled in, while Richard's composure faltered just enough to reveal the crack beneath the surface. "Your wife?" Richard repeated, the word unfamiliar in his mouth now, his gaze shifting instinctively toward Emily, who stood a short distance behind Daniel, her expression unchanged, her silence more powerful than any explanation. Daniel did not turn around. He did not need to. "Yes," he said simply. "The woman you just turned away." The air seemed to thin, the polished elegance of the hotel suddenly feeling fragile under the weight of that truth. A guest nearby shifted uncomfortably. Another glanced at the staff with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief, and somewhere in the background, a glass was set down just a little too quickly, the sound sharper than it should have been. Richard took a step forward, his posture adjusting, his tone shifting rapidly in an attempt to recover. "There must have been a misunderstanding," he said, his words coming quicker now, less controlled. "We would never intentionally refuse." Daniel raised his hand slightly, not abruptly, not aggressively, but enough to stop the sentence before it could continue. The gesture was small, but it carried absolute finality. "You already did," Daniel said, his voice still calm, still measured, but now unmistakably firm. The receptionist swallowed, her earlier confidence replaced by a growing unease that crept into every movement, every glance she dared to make. Richard's eyes flickered again toward Emily, then back to Daniel, as if searching for something that might undo what had already been done. But there was nothing. No explanation, no excuse that could rewrite the moment that had just passed. Daniel took one slow step closer to the desk, his presence now undeniable, his voice lowering just enough to force everyone nearby to listen more carefully. "Tell me," he said, his gaze fixed on Richard, "when you decided she did not belong here, what exactly were you basing that on?" The question hung in the air, simple, direct, impossible to deflect. And for the first time since he had walked into that lobby, Richard Hayes had no immediate answer. The silence that followed was no longer just tension. It was exposure. And in that silence, the truth stood clearly for everyone to see. Richard Hayes opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, the words he had prepared dissolving before they could take shape, his mind searching for something that sounded reasonable, something that sounded justified, but finding nothing that could survive the weight of the question now hanging in the air. The silence stretched, pressing against him, against the receptionist, against everyone within earshot, and for the first time, the polished confidence that had defined him just minutes earlier began to fracture. "Sir, we follow certain guidelines," he finally managed, his voice no longer as steady, the careful control slipping just enough to be noticed. "Our guests typically—" Daniel did not interrupt, but the stillness in his expression made it clear that the explanation was not enough. Not even close. "Typically what?" Daniel asked quietly, his tone unchanged, yet somehow sharper, more precise. Richard hesitated again, his eyes flickering briefly toward Emily, then back, as if hoping the answer might be found somewhere outside of himself. "We aim to provide a certain experience," he continued, choosing his words carefully, though each one seemed weaker than the last. "And sometimes that requires discretion in how we allocate our rooms." The phrase hung in the air, vague, carefully constructed, and yet completely transparent in its meaning. Daniel's gaze did not shift. "Discretion," he repeated, the single word landing with quiet emphasis. Behind the desk, the receptionist lowered her head slightly, her earlier composure now replaced by a growing awareness that every word spoken was only making things worse. A guest nearby shifted his stance, folding his arms as he listened, no longer pretending not to notice. Emily remained where she was, her posture relaxed, her eyes steady, watching not with anger, but with a calm clarity that made the moment even more difficult to escape. Daniel took another slow step forward, close enough now that the distance between him and the desk felt almost symbolic, as if it marked the line between assumption and reality. "Let me make this simple," he said, his voice even, controlled, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "You saw my wife walk in, and you decided she did not fit your definition of who belongs here." Richard swallowed, the movement subtle but visible, his confidence continuing to erode under the quiet pressure. "That was not the intention," he replied quickly, though the words sounded hollow even as he spoke them. Daniel did not react to the denial. Instead, he let the silence return for a brief moment, allowing the truth to settle more deeply than any argument could. Then, slowly, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small card, placing it gently on the marble counter between them. The motion was deliberate, unhurried, and yet it carried a finality that shifted the entire atmosphere of the room. The receptionist's eyes dropped to the card first, her breath catching as she read the name printed in clean, unmistakable lettering. Her hand instinctively moved closer, as if to confirm what she was seeing, though she already knew. Richard followed her gaze, and the moment his eyes focused on the card, everything changed. The color in his face drained just enough to reveal the realization that had been building but not yet fully formed. His shoulders stiffened, his posture adjusting, but not in confidence this time, in recognition. The name was not unfamiliar. It was impossible to ignore. Daniel Carter, owner. The words seemed to echo louder than anything that had been said before. Around them, the quiet had deepened into something absolute. No one spoke. No one moved. And in that silence, the truth no longer needed explanation. It was already understood. Richard Hayes stared at the card as if it might change if he looked at it long enough, his fingers hovering just above the marble surface without daring to touch it, his mind racing through every decision he had made in the last 10 minutes, each one now echoing louder than the last. The receptionist took a small step back, her breath shallow, her earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by a quiet panic that she could not quite hide. Around them, the guests who had been watching now made no effort to look away, their attention fixed on the unfolding moment, the polished elegance of the hotel, now serving as a stage for something far more revealing than luxury. Richard finally lifted his gaze from the card to Daniel, his posture shifting, the authority he once carried replaced by something far more fragile. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice tight, careful, as if each word needed to be measured before it left his mouth. "I was not aware." He stopped, the sentence collapsing under its own weight before it could finish. Daniel did not respond immediately. He allowed the silence to return, his eyes steady, giving Richard just enough space to understand that awareness was never the point. Emily remained behind him, her presence quiet but undeniable, her calm expression unchanged, as though she had already moved past the moment that still held everyone else in place. "You were not aware," Daniel repeated slowly, his voice calm, almost reflective, yet carrying a precision that made it impossible to ignore. "That is exactly the problem." The words settled heavily into the space between them. Richard swallowed, his composure slipping further as he tried to recover. "If I had known," he began, his tone shifting quickly, almost urgently now, "the situation would have been handled very differently." Daniel's expression did not change. "That is also the problem," he replied, his voice still even, still controlled, but now edged with something unmistakable. The receptionist looked down at the counter, her hands clasping together tightly, the weight of what had happened pressing in from all sides. A bellman near the entrance stood completely still, his earlier movements frozen, as if any sound might disrupt the gravity of the moment. Richard's shoulders stiffened, his mind searching for something to hold on to, something that could restore the balance he had just lost. "We pride ourselves on exceptional service," he said, though the statement sounded hollow now, stripped of the confidence it once carried. Daniel leaned slightly forward, not aggressively, but with enough intent to draw every ounce of attention back to him. "Exceptional service does not begin when you recognize a name," he said quietly. "It begins the moment someone walks through those doors." The simplicity of the statement cut deeper than any accusation could have. No raised voice, no harsh tone, just truth laid bare in its clearest form. Richard's gaze faltered, dropping for a brief second before he forced it back up, though the certainty was gone. The guests nearby shifted subtly, some exchanging glances, others watching in silence, the atmosphere now charged with a kind of clarity that could not be undone. Daniel straightened again, his posture returning to that composed stillness that defined him, his presence filling the space without effort. "My wife did not ask for special treatment," he continued, his voice steady. "She asked for the same respect you offered everyone else." Behind him, Emily's eyes moved briefly across the room, taking in the faces, the reactions, the quiet realization settling into the space, before returning to Daniel. And in that moment, no one spoke, no one moved, because the truth no longer needed to be explained. It had already been seen.